Hi there, you're listening to Prague Talk, a podcast from Radio Prague International. My name is Ian Willoughby. My guest this time is Milan Babík, who was recently appointed director of the Václav Havel Library here in Prague. Like many people, I hadn't heard of Milan before he got the post, and that's in large part because he'd spent the previous 3 decades in the United States, where he effectively emigrated as a teenager in search of educational opportunity. When I spoke to Milan Babík at the library, a stone's throw from Prague's Národní, we discussed the institution's mission and perceptions of Václav Havel today. But our conversation began with his own early life, as you'll hear now in this edition of Prague Talk. Could you please first tell us something about your own story? Your online bio says that you grew up next door to Soviet barracks in Šumperk.
That's right. I'm from this small town in what used to be or is Sudetenland, Jeseníky Mountains. And I was born in a house which had Soviet barracks right next door. So that's my childhood in the immediate sort of vicinity of Soviet troops, playing with them and collecting pins and insignia and so on.
I wanted to ask you, how were they seen by the locals? Were they totally kind of cut off?
It was a town within a town. Basically, the neighborhood around the barracks was known as the Soviet neighborhood. So they lived their own lives. There was not too much interaction. But at the same time, they were kind of a part of the daily life of the town. You saw them all over the place, marching up and down the streets, and the tanks leaving the barracks to go to the shooting range was quite normal for us.
Do you remember when they all left?
I do remember. It was a big deal. It was either 1990 or 1991. And I do remember my parents and my grandparents who lived with us standing by the window and taking pictures very carefully because we were not allowed to photograph the artillery pieces and the tanks and all of that. But it was a great deal, and we do have in our family archive a snapshot of the last tank leaving the town.
What was the situation of your own family in the communist period?
So my grandparents were not favorably disposed towards the regime. This had to do with deeper background. My grandfather on my maternal side essentially fought on the Eastern Front, but with the Wehrmacht. So he hated them. There are many anecdotes of him tossing heads of rotten lettuce across the fence at them, cursing them out, and so on. My parents, I would describe as sort of ordinary normalization era middle class, employed at the hospital, and so on.
I have to ask you this because listeners will also be thinking this. What was your grandfather doing in the Wehrmacht?
Well, he was recruited there from the Sudetenland, pretty much against his will, but that was the story around Těšín. That's what happened in the late 1930s when the Germans sort of started recruiting aggressively among the populations in that area.
In the mid-90s, you got a scholarship to go to a boarding school in the US from the Foundation for a Civil Society. It was set up by Wendy Lures, whose husband, William or Bill Lures, had been the US ambassador to Czechoslovakia in the mid-80s.
That's right. They had a foundation which they set up, I believe, in the early 1990s, Foundation for Civil Society. It is still around today, although it no longer sort of is active when it comes to Central East European students and scholarships abroad. But this is how I got to the United States when I was 16. I took part in a binational Czech and Slovak high school students competition, which they organized. Several rounds, selection rounds, starting at my local gymnasium in Šumperk and then proceeding to Prague and so on. So about 450 applicants and 20 scholarships to boarding schools in the UK and the United States, and I had one of them.
And the Lures, the couple, they had been friendly or they had some connection with Václav Havel?
That is correct. I did not know much about that at the time, but at this point, when I know Wendy quite well from my dealings with the Václav Havel Center and other sort of Havel circles in the United States, there are many sort of images and pictures where they stand side by side, Bill and Wendy and Václav Havel and Olga Havlova in 1989, late 1989 and early 1990.
Where did you go in the States, the school, and how did you find it? It must have been kind of mind-blowing.
So I didn't find the school found me. I was simply assigned the school. That was part of the procedure. The schools picked whoever they wanted to essentially invite for that year. And in my case, it was Berkshire School in Western Massachusetts. It looked nothing like what I imagined the United States would look like, skyscrapers and urban landscapes and so on. It's a beautiful campus in the middle of nowhere.
With lots of trees everywhere.
Lots of trees. Berkshires, which I've become very fond of by now, of course. It's essentially a mountain range in Western Massachusetts, but it is very, very rural.
Probably it wasn't that unusual to go to a school in the States. But what I'm curious about is why you essentially stayed away from the Czech Republic for so long.
So it had to do with, I would say, two sets of factors. I did not intend to stay at the boarding school longer than 1 year. Those were the terms of the scholarship. I fully intended to come back and continue my studies at the gymnasium and then perhaps join foreign service, work at the foreign ministry here. But as it turns out, the system, the schooling system in this country at that time was not well equipped to absorb us coming back here. They wanted us to do all kinds of sort of make-up exams and catch up on the missed work. And they did not have much appreciation for the work we've achieved in the United States. So that was one set of factors. And the other was that Berkshire School immediately offered a full scholarship, let me finish high school there. And then when it was time to essentially apply to universities, the story repeated itself. On the one hand, sort of my inability to get my high school diploma and the work done there recognized here, gain the proper credentials that will allow me to apply to university here, and at the same time, full scholarships and offers from prestigious universities in the Western world.
What did your family and your friends here make of the fact that you essentially emigrated as a teenager?
It's a very unusual situation. As I mentioned, I come from a very sort of middle-class background where none of my parents or grandparents speaks any English. There is Russian, as you might imagine, but not English. Haven't traveled much at all. So I strayed. I am the exception in all regards. It gave rise to many interesting dynamics, unusual dynamics later on with, once I had children and so on, but that is the situation.
You also studied in the UK, you went to the London School of Economics and to Oxford. Then you gradually, entered academia in the US. What were you teaching?
My background is in international relations, theory, linguistic theory, sort of the, linguistic, as they're called, approaches to international politics. So that also sort of defined my course offerings. Introduction to International Relations, History of American Foreign Policy, Central European Politics, Political Theory, and so on.
Now you're the director of the Václav Havel Library in Prague. Did you come back for the job, or did you come back and then get the job?
I came back because the job was offered to me at the right time in my professional career and personal circumstances, at a point where I was becoming a bit disappointed, disenchanted with the way that higher education has been evolving in the United States, the implications of political correctness for freedom of speech and thought and so on. So that's one set of circumstances. And the other was the fact that the Board of Trustees of Václav Havel Library essentially approached me and started talking to me around half a year ago, Christmas of last year, about the possibility, and that's how this all came together.
I presume you visited here quite often, but still, how was the adjustment, or how has the adjustment been to living again in this country for you and, of course, your family, who I presume didn't know much about Czechia?
Actually, my children, I have 2 boys, they're 15 and 16. I raised them bilingual. We maintained close contact with the country every summer for at least a month. And then during the month of January, for the last 4 or 5 years, I've been running a study abroad program at my last university. So I was bringing students to Prague. So I actually maintained a pretty close link with the country throughout. So in that regard, the adjustment is not dramatic.
But still there are differences. What are the hardest things to get used to about living here again?
Negotiating with whether partners or adversaries is not nearly as straightforward as, let's say, in the United States. I lack this sort of American directness and sincerity in that regard. It's obviously a different sort of cultural background, but other than that, it's in some ways very familiar. It's the country of my birth. It's my native country. In some ways, I'm really coming back home, although not as a native anymore, really as a kind of a foreigner, because that's what 30 years abroad does to you.
For people who are not familiar with the Václav Havel Library, or maybe only know the name, what exactly does the organization do?
The mission of the organization is to preserve and spread the legacy of our first post-communist president, Václav Havel. And we do that through a number of different, in a number of different ways. We have educational programs, workshops for schools. We run conferences. We award the annual Václav Havel Prize for Human Rights, together with Charter 77 and the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. So large-scale sort of events, conferences. We publish works by Václav Havel, mainly in Czech, occasionally also in translation. And we, of course, have an archive. So we function as a documentation center as well.
How does the Havel Library compare to presidential libraries in the States? Also, are they more like actual libraries? Because I found the word library a little bit confusing in this regard.
Yes, it's a placeholder, the term library. They're not typical libraries in the United States or in our instance. When it comes to the Václav Havel Library, we are civil society sort of actors. We certainly do more than ordinary libraries do. But to come back to your first question, how does the Václav Havel Library compare to the institutions in the United States? Well, our budget in comparison is minuscule, which would be lovely to change. But at the same time, Václav Havel in many ways was inspired by the American model of the presidential library. So that's something that certainly features in our background.
This year, the Havel Library is marking 20 years of existence. The further we get away from Havel's era and the further from his death in 2011, does it become harder to generate interest and to keep attracting funding?
In terms of funding, I've been in my role for only 3 months, so I can't yet answer that question. I'm exploring the availability and so on. But in terms of interest, that's a very interesting question in its own right. On the one hand, the generation or the set of generations for whom Havel was a known figure and a familiar name are slowly leaving us, right? So we're talking about demographic shifts. And among the younger generations, it is not to be taken for granted that they know Havel. In fact, they tend not to. And that is part of our mission, to make sure that his name and his legacy, what he stood for, his ideals, his principles, that they remain very much part of the conversation, even though many of the things that we experience in our daily lives today, information technology, social media, the rise of AI, he could not have foreseen, but that is how he envisioned the library. He envisioned it as a living sort of place for debate and discussion that would respond to new phenomena as they would come.
In recent years, the name Havel has seemed to become more divisive here in Czechia. For a certain section of society, it's an insult. They have a word Haveloid that they use. What do you make of the fact that Havel, for some people, has these negative connotations?
I think it certainly is something that we cannot deny. I am perfectly aware of that. I read this development in the larger context of sort of social and political fragmentation that has been taking place not just here in the Czech Republic, but really all over Europe and also in the United States. Polarization, the labeling, and really kind of flattening of Havel's legacy and the legacy of others. They're becoming just easy stamps, sort of call words, but not much thinking takes place, not much actual debate, all in keeping with the shortening attention spans cultivated by the rise of social media a lack of sort of sustained thought and longer expression.
My final question is, clearly you think Havel has something still to say to the modern world, to young people. What is it?
Many things. For me personally, he played a fundamental role in helping to bring about the sort of changes that then enabled me to do what I wanted to do, which was to explore the world outside of the borders of Czechoslovakia and then the Czech Republic. Freedom of travel, freedom of speech, and so on. But in particular, I'm fond of his sort of emphasis on language, that politics in many ways begins with language and with symbols. To me, his power of the powerless is in many ways a meditation on the role of symbols and language and how they can either channel complicity and conformity or can be used to mount some kind of resistance to the status quo and so on.
Many thanks indeed to Milan Babík, the new director of the Václav Havel Library, for speaking to me for Prague Talk, a podcast from Radio Prague International. Prague Talk's been going for a couple of years now, so if you're new to the pod, why not check out some of the numerous earlier editions and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. But for now, from me, Ian Willoughby, thank you so much for listening to Prague Talk. I'll talk to you again very soon.